All right, let's give it up for SCN. You're here, you enjoyed it. We're pushing through to the end, which is not to say tomorrow there also aren't incredibly engaging materials to witness. So I have the pleasure of being joined on stage by Brian Baik and Eric, who you know very well by now. But we're going to share with you a bit of a deep dive into something that Eric previewed yesterday, and that's a look at the way in which we can validate the connectivity that Mark just talked about. We are all in community. We are perhaps underneath competitors, but we do want to support each other in reaching to the highest heights together. So first of all, my name's Kyeema Peart. I'm the first legislated state director for Nevada, and that was something that was brought in 2023, and we had the pleasure of initiating what has become a bit of a wildfire across the country. And so there are many other state entrepreneurship directors now that have been born out of that effort. I have on my left Brian Baik, and he's from Harvard Business School. He'll share a little bit more. And obviously working together with Eric, we're joining in a research project that's going to take a deep dive into the Co-Founder OS system. So first of all, Brian, share a little bit about where you hearken from.
Sure. Thanks, Kyeema. Great to meet you all. My name is Brian Baik. I'm an assistant professor at Harvard Business School. I'm really excited to talk and join here today. My core research interests lies in how information, different types of information, for example, financial information, some sort of area or industry information is related to startups, and the project or the research project that we hope to conduct with Co-Founder OS is really the central part of my research agenda, and which is gaining a lot of support from all sorts of different areas like economics, finance, and accounting. So really happy to be here and talk about some of the things that we're about to do.
Thank you so much, Brian. Eric, as an extension of the introduction that maybe we've had the last couple of days and your obvious love for Augusta, can you share with us how you came to develop Co-Founder OS, which is the support platform we're going to be interacting with in the research, and how, in fact, you considered a research-based approach to validation the right way to go?
Sure. Yeah, the Co-Founder OS was really born out of the challenge that we were facing in trying to run credentialing programs at large scale across the country, and how would you actually optimize both the workflow of the ESO who's doing the work with everybody, but also make sure that the experience for the entrepreneur is supportive for them and not distracting from their business. And so we basically saw what was happening with generative AI, and we said, this is an opportunity, instead of maybe thinking for people, of helping people understand how to think about their business and present them with basically a bunch of circumstances where they get to check against their own assumptions and their own bias about how they do a business. And it allowed us to begin measuring entrepreneurial skills in an applied manner versus just in a rote memorization place. And that created an enormous opportunity for us to change how we really measure what's happening under the hood in entrepreneurship. Because I think that we all face the same problem, that no one believes us when we say, what our economic impact is or which entrepreneurs will succeed. And so it was just really building a system that automates our ability in this room, like for all of us, to do that and to track the long-term efficacy of it, so that our entrepreneurs can actually get funding, and we might actually get more funding to support them.
So what Eric is describing is essentially the interface of an entrepreneurial support organization in growing regional economic prosperity, which we all know results in better community well-being, but then at the same time raising up those individual entrepreneurs for their greatest chance of success. And so what we want to check is that since this is a scalable system, which is something I was very excited about in Nevada, because we don't necessarily have the might of some of these other civic or metropole centers, and we need to be able to move past the funnel approach where we don't have 95% attrition looking for our 1 to 5 unicorns, but we in fact are raising all the boats. And so in this way, Eric has hearkened on the fact that it's interactive, so it grows the entrepreneur and their future business. But what we wanted to test in the research that we're about to do together with Harvard and a French institution who's known for developing new ways of managing innovation and entrepreneurship, that's the Grenoble Business Institute, we're looking at how we can enrich that process to bring information and support more seamlessly alongside the entrepreneur. And now, Brian, with your specific interest in information, what information sources are of most interest to you and you anticipate would be most beneficial to entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think overall, financial information for different types of peers. It could be with the industry peers, or it could be with some of the peers that are in the similar region, let's say county or MSAs, I think would be very important in the sense that a lot of these prior academic research in economics, finance, and accounting, they all point to one direction, that some sort of peer information matters. And peer information that is within the region of a startup, for example, or in the same industry of a startup, I think that is extremely valuable for startups to gain additional information about some of the industry landscapes or metro level landscapes of how this economy is doing. And essentially, therefore, startups can develop strategies accordingly to generate the right business decisions.
So what we're looking at is not just the entrepreneur's capacity and their customer engagement strategy, but where that's going to play out, and looking at the market readiness for adoption. One of the things I know that's been a priority for you, Eric, is this notion of democratizing access to that kind of information, or perhaps a national standardization approach. Why has that become a passion that you felt the need to champion for your support platform?
Simply put, I'm really tired of everybody that does this work trying to just fight to make a living doing it. And if we can create this standard, it makes it easier for us to build performance-based models, because we're working together across the same language that everybody has everywhere in the country or potentially across the world, and how we measure entrepreneurs. And then that creates portability of this credential so that you can go between any financial institution, whether you're getting a CDFI loan in your community or an angel investment from a different community. And so that allows us to match entrepreneurs based on industry verticals, demographics, anything that's going on, and then have a scoring methodology that people understand and they accept and adopt.
So I think there may be a little controversy in that, which we'll cover off in a moment. But one of the things I just want to be sure that we all understand, and I've had the pleasure of working with the Grenoble Institute on doing some innovative decision-making research, and there are, in fact, two systems by which a decision maker will process information. And now the first, you might know very comfortably, is your gut feeling, your response, your intuitive response. In academic research, this is called System 1, and this is part of behavioral economics. It was a Nobel Prize awarded in the early 2000s. And yet, intuition alone won't necessarily enable you to process the information. What we found is that if you prompt and prime and probe the decision maker to then engage their System 2 capabilities, that's the analytical and more cognitive strategy that helps you personalize or develop a regionalized approach to the decision at hand and not just go with what you've always done. So I want to turn it back to Brian. When we know how decision making works, how it operates, there's a matter of seeing information at face value, but there's also the necessary component of interpreting that information. Can you share with us a little bit about how we're going to be testing or reviewing that in the research program?
Of course. I do feel information processing is extremely important in addition to obtaining the information. So before you even go to this information processing, the information itself at the aggregated at the industry level, I think is beneficial in some ways, in the sense that these information that we are about to curate and deliver are all public sources of information. However, many startup entrepreneurs probably wouldn't have enough time to gather these information, compile it into an industry or in a regional level, because entrepreneurs they spend most of their time just thinking about the core products that they're about to make. Now, what it becomes even more important, in addition to curating that information, is the interpretation. And what I mean by that is even if you look at some of these information, so the curated information kind of suggests or signifies like an industry level sales growth, profitability, the size of the industry, and different types of trading multiples. So how valuable or how much, how is the stock market in that industry or an area doing? So if it's trading on a higher multiple, then probably startups can look for additional venture capital financing because they have a favorable market condition. But how are entrepreneurs really going to digest all these types of information and generate rational business decisions, I think, is another story. And because of that, I think providing some sort of interpretation to what these statistics or metrics really mean is going to be extremely important. And in the report that we are going to provide some sort of a interpretation about some of the metrics that the entrepreneurs are going to see. However, I also do believe that there needs to be additional support systems, either it be from generative AI or either from human mentoring, to really digest and what are some of the implications of the numbers that the startups or the entrepreneurs might be seeing.
And Eric, this isn't a new concept. AI is something that you've been working with, and obviously the rest of the world is catching on to your leadership approach. And we're looking now at how, in fact, should AI or could AI best be complemented by human mentorship. So what are some of the early findings you've found from OS in operation to date with respect to AI versus human mentorship?
Yeah, my favorite thing about what we've done is seeing how integrating AI into our mentoring process has changed the relationship that we have with our founders. And that, generally speaking, before, when I would talk to a founder about their business and I would have pressing questions that they needed to address around different biases that they may have, they would just think I'm telling them that their baby's ugly, and they would fight me about that. And they were like, you just don't get it. You just don't like me. You don't like my idea. There's something about that. And when we have a computer that gives them that basic information, because there's so much of what we say that we just say it over and over and over to hundreds, if not thousands of founders, that when they get that and they get a score, then all of a sudden they look at me as their human mentor and say, how can you help me beat this video game? Right? And that's what we've sort of transformed it into. It's like we take this entire process and they become more incentivized, because you'd be surprised how many people become completionists of like, I want to make sure that I maximize my score here. But the big thing that I've also discovered along the way is, if you don't have a human in the loop, then they don't necessarily engage the software either. And so the one thing that we've seen as a mistake in communities over and over is they hear, oh, this is an AI system. We're going to just give it to the entrepreneurs as a fully on-demand platform, and you get 25, 30% engagement rates. When you have a human in that process, you have an 85 to 90% engagement rate. Now, the thing that happens is once an entrepreneur engages into the system, we have a 75 to 80% completion rate. And if they do complete this entire process, we have a 70% likelihood that they're going to be growing revenues within 90 days. So what we're really focused on is how do we get that right mix of the human support, but with an AI making this augmentation from the AI so that you can actually support 10 or 20 times the number of founders.
And so that's what made me very excited about Co-Founder OS, was this notion that we could work together across a unified platform to maximize our efforts. We're all strapped for the human mentorship component. There's only so many pitch competition slots for us to actually give feedback. If we could, in essence, do a prep session before the mentorship, then, and say that again for me, 70% of those who complete will be revenue generating within
90 days.
90 days, 3 months. Who in our ESO communities would not be ecstatic to share that with future investors? That's where standardization and scalability, frankly, become so important. But the bottom line is, without information for AI and mentorship to riff off, then we are just believing that the emperor has clothes on. And so, Brian, I want to bring it back to the fact that the access to the information then becomes the gatekeeping challenge. And we all know, and I won't name names, but there are gatekeepers of some of this information, which actually causes for there to be significant disparities. It's only affordable by institutions to access some of those licenses. And so we end up with information inequality. And if information is power, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, I think some of the research that we're about to do has, I think, a lot of policy-related implications. One is that because we're building off of all these public resources or public data sets that are available, I think it's extremely important for, as a policy, to maybe help aggregate some of these information and provide access, especially to entrepreneurs that really need a lot of these information to make the right business decisions. So I think the first step for us would be to really test whether these types of aggregate information really matters for the startups, and if so, to what extent. And if our hypothesis really is validated as true, then I think we could imply or suggest that there needs to be some sort of policy to not just provide raw data, but some sort of a more curated data set where entrepreneurs might have better access. And in addition to that, obviously, there needs to be some sort of education or guidance in terms of how we can interpret that information.
And the NSF, in their innovation engine approach, considers that educators and entrepreneurs are just part of our essential ecosystem stakeholders. And so in addition to that, of course, we have our investors, we have our ESOs and enabling agents, and we have our regulators and policymakers. So if we look at the notion of national standardization, and that can be a bit scary. You provided the example of getting our licenses verified through a licensing program. Many of us drove a tractor when we were growing up. That didn't necessarily give us the ability to be on the freeway or to operate in traffic. And so if we make our entrepreneurs, our systems open to a third-party designee for credentialing, does that set ourselves up, in essence, to have some of our tractor drivers fail the test? And so we have to go back to the beginning. And how do we overcome that when we're making these bold policy statements for greater equality and access to resources?
I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say that that's always some inherent sort of risk. Fundamentally, introducing a credential into the process is adding a layer of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is something that I think we all are trying to fight against. How do we minimize the regulation and the steps that people have to go through? But what we've tried to do is design a system where at any entry point for an entrepreneur, they're getting a score and they're getting really specific feedback about their business and a pathway to an entrepreneur support organization so that they can work through that issue, so that they can still get access to capital. So we're trying to create, like, for lack of better terms, in an ecosystem of support around them. And so every single person that's inside of the software, they have an ecosystem that's there, and they can see every support organization. But I think that really just looking through this in the big picture lens of the research study itself, this allows us to begin looking at it also through a much longer term lens, so that instead of talking about things in a 90-day state, which 90 days is just that point where you're sort of cheerleading, like, rah, 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 yeah, I have something, and you can fake it through 90 days, but this gives us the opportunity to look at it in a long-term lens, and so that we know that this is actually the thing that helps them succeed. And so even if we stop that tractor driver from driving a tractor, what we're actually stopping them from is foreclosure on their home. And that's why it's important to get this type of information there.
And I think you've underscored for us the building blocks that go into making this a sustainable approach. And one of the things that excited me when I was the director of entrepreneurship for Nevada was that this is something that all regions can access, that all regions can use in order to capitalize on the potential of their region, because there are a lot of latent entrepreneurial activities that don't receive that kind of ecosystem support. And maybe one thing just to finish on as we move into our next presentation, it seems to me that what we end up doing is democratizing access to information, but then we also democratize access to investment dollars. And that came up in a syndicate question yesterday, but also applies to federal funding if it comes back online for us. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, at the very surface level, the first thing that we've already done is align entrepreneur support with workforce development. And so that's a $10 billion a year pathway towards funding in entrepreneur support. And we've been able to work with a number of, CDFIs, microlenders around the country so that they use this AI system. They use the credential as a pathway to say, we will at least have a really solid conversation with you. We have pre-qualification forms that they can basically apply for a loan that way. And so it allows them to get immediate feedback about how well they're doing relative to this process. And so, yeah, this is ultimately just a method to scale capital across the board by expanding trust.
And one of the things that we're very conscious of is that if we're going to democratize this across the US, we probably should also look at other areas globally where this can take effect. Europe is a place that obviously through the Grenoble participation we have access to. Can you say just a little more about how you expect to roll out from a national to an international parallel?
Of course. I think the difference between US and international is pretty interesting because one of the big distinctions between the US and international, especially Europe, is that many European countries, they do have, or many private firms, if they're above a certain size threshold, they do disclose financial statements even if they are private, whereas US, most of the private firms do not. So what I think is really interesting in this compared to the US is that when we curate some of these data sets, we will be able to get some of these private financial information, which makes this comparison, or maybe it is the private firms that might have a similar size to the startups, I think would be pretty relevant. And highlighting that difference, I think, would be extremely important when we think about studying in the US versus international.
And then the exciting thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that that's the beginning. I was born in Australia. I spent my early part of the career in Canada, and I know we've got South African colleagues here in the audience. So, in essence, the world becomes your oyster, Eric.
I mean, that sounds wonderful. This is really, though, about empowering the field. Yesterday, we talked a lot about the idea of ensuring that we create a transparent governance process around this. Honestly, I think that the work that we do is one of the fundamental pillars to bring about world peace. People think I'm a hippie all the time for these types of things, but this is not necessarily about anything else other than creating a world where people are closer and more connected and feel less division between each other. And I think entrepreneurship is the pathway to that.
Again, floating all boats. If you join me in a round of applause, we have time, I think, just for a couple of questions, but I'll make sure that you've got our information and you can look us up afterward. So if you wanted to access a microphone, I believe there's one that's going to be, thank you very much, in circulation. Please feel free to address questions to any one of our panel members.